Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually a little bit worried about the title because one of the problems of talking about vaccines is when you put up a title that says vaccines cause autisms, a significant fraction of the world is going to think you're serious. So it's with some trepidation. So I thought I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the history of vaccines and the impact they've made, spend a few minutes talking about some new things that are coming in vaccines, and then the last part of the talk talking about why we have so much trouble behaving rationally in the world of vaccines. So let's start. If you think about what the 20th century is going to be known for, you tend to think about flight, computers, the internet. There's a long list of things that have made huge differences, but it is perhaps true that the biggest difference in the 20th century is the extension of life expectancy. Okay, the 20th century is going to be known as the century in which health got better. What this increase in life expectancy translates to is what some people have said is the best argument for birth control. Delaying the age at which you have a child increases that child's life expectancy by 3 months for every year that you delay. Okay? So if you delay childbearing for 5 years, you are giving your child an extra year and a third of life. Okay? But a huge difference, okay? You will notice on this graph, on this steady increase, notice a couple of things, okay? First of all, you will notice that this is American data because we don't have Canadian data, which is an ongoing problem. But the second thing you'll see, you know what that dip is? That's the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. And just a reminder that infectious diseases are still with us and are capable of having a substantial and unexpected impact. Okay, so what's that increase in life expectancy from? It's really hard to tease out how much of it is better hygiene, better nutrition, how much of it is advances in public health, and probably the biggest difference in improving people's lives is not about vaccines at all, it's about safe food and water. And if you're interested in thinking about this process, I would recommend to you a book called The Ghost Map, which is about the invention of epidemiology as we know it, the study of population, the understanding that pathogens cause disease, right? Before the cholera epidemic in London in 1854, people knew what you got sick from, right? It was called miasms. You went too close to the swamp, okay? It took a long time after that epidemic for people to understand that the identification of the Broad Street pump and the water from the Broad Street pump as a source of cholera in London's cholera epidemic was because microbes cause disease. But a big piece of the decrease has also been vaccines. So after safe food and water, the next piece of a reduction in mortality is about vaccines. And the first wave of vaccines were introduced between 1920 and 1940. So this graph is now a reverse, okay? So this is deaths, and you see this big peak in 1918, and then you see this steady decrease down to 1980. That it's about water supplies, that it's about the establishment of public health, that it's about antibiotics, and that it's about vaccines. Okay. And just to give you a marker of what the impact of vaccines are, this is reported cases of measles in the United States between 1950 and 2001. First measles vaccines were introduced in the late 1960s, and as you expect, you see a dramatic decrease. Here's tetanus with vaccination, beginning of toxoid vaccines used, new vaccines in the 30s, and then incorporation into the vaccine that we now use that has diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis in it in the mid-1940s. Okay, so reliably you introduce vaccines and vaccines disappear. Smallpox, of course, is the biggest success story of vaccination. In the 1960s, when we had functionally eradicated smallpox from North America, smallpox still killed one person every 20 seconds in the world. Okay? Smallpox is now eradicated, right? Last case in the world in 1970, last natural case in the world in 1978, there was a small outbreak associated with a lab release in the UK some years later. But there now is no more smallpox. What's the next disease on the list for eradication? Polio. Yeah, so how are we doing with polio? Well, whoops, sorry, let me go back for a minute. Okay, so here's old vaccine cases. Okay, so smallpox was the first vaccine preventable disease eradicated in Canada. Then it's in the 1930s, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus. Polio vaccines introduced in the 1950s. Polio, interestingly, paralytic polio is a disease of increased hygiene. The reason that polio became evident in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was because polio is a virus that infects the GI tract. In very low socioeconomic status countries, okay, so think the entire world in the 1880s, children get exposed to poliovirus when they're less than 6 months of age. Poliovirus infects their GI tract and gives them permanent immunity to the disease, but they don't get paralytic polio because they have their mother's antibody. Okay, maternal antibody gets transmitted to fetuses in the last half of pregnancy. And the reason that you get paralytic polio is when a virus that normally infects your GI tract gets out of your GI tract and into your central nervous system and causes paralysis. Doesn't happen to most people. Most people get polio and never get sick from it. And if you get it when your mother's antibodies are in your body, you don't get paralytic polio. But maternal antibody has a half-life of somewhere between 3 and 6 months. So by the time you're a year old, you've lost all your maternal antibody. And if you live in a place that has clean food and water, you get exposed to polio later. Okay, you're not continuously drinking and exposed to water that is contaminated with fecal material, which people were, until we developed good water systems and clean water. And so you tend to get it from other kids in the community and when you go swimming in the lake. And that happens when you're older, you don't have your maternal antibodies, and a fraction of people then get paralytic polio. So paralytic polio literally appeared in the 20th century in association with higher standards of living, okay? And this is what polio, so this is a rehab ward in a hospital in California with primarily kids, but you can also see some adults in iron lungs, which allowed people to stay alive while you waited for the paralysis to recover. Sometimes it did, sometimes it did not. And in the 40s and 50s, polio was a terrifying disease. The introduction of vaccine in the early 50s in North America very quickly eradicated polio in North America. By 1988, there was still a very substantial amount of polio in the world, and the red countries on this map are countries where polio was endemic in 1988. And 1988 was the year that the World Health Organization made a commitment to the eradication of polio. Okay, how are we doing? Well, here's 2002. By 2002, down to 7 countries with endemic polio on the planet. That time was that polio was going to be eradicated by 2005 or 2006. People were really thought we were doing very well. And then in about 2004, there was a really substantial setback because in Nigeria, a very powerful group of Muslim clerics started a campaign suggesting that polio vaccine was actually a mechanism for sterilizing Muslim women and and polio vaccination campaigns in Nigeria took a big hit. And you're going to roll your eyes at this, and I want you to remember how you're feeling when we talk about another vaccine later on, okay? And so by the late 2000s, polio had moved back into about 8 other countries, and people sat down a few years ago and had a very serious discussion about whether we could, in fact, eradicate polio from the world and whether we should invest in doing it. It's a very expensive thing to do to eradicate a disease. And the result of that discussion about 4 years ago was that we should be committed to eradicating polio, and so people have gone back to it with a vengeance. And here we are in 2015 with only 2 countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, where polio remains endemic. It continues to be a huge amount of hard work, and if you read the New York Times, you will recognize New York Times, in my view, deserves a lot of credit for keeping the polio story alive. They routinely report on polio eradication efforts in Pakistan, and every month vaccinators are killed by the Taliban. This is a true and heroic commitment on the part of people running vaccination programs in Pakistan and Afghanistan to try to make sure that we are protected from poliovirus. Then, after polio in North America, we moved on to other diseases, and here's the introduction of the vaccine against Haemophilus influenza type B. By the 1980s, Haemophilus type B influenza was the most common cause of childhood meningitis. And every year, the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto saw 22 cases of meningitis due to Haemophilus influenza type B. And here's the introduction of the first vaccine that was only for older children in 1986, followed by the infant conjugate vaccine in 1993. And part of the reason for putting up this slide is about thinking Haemophilus influenza type B was the first time that we had illustrated to us the importance of herd immunity to a disease. So you will notice that on this slide there's kids who are 2 and under and children who are over 2. And these 2 first vaccines could only be given to children who were 18 months old. So when we started vaccinating kids, we started vaccinating 18-month-olds, but look at the decline in disease in children under 2. So the decline in disease is not directly due to children being vaccinated, it's due to them being protected by older children who are vaccinated. And at the same time as we introduced vaccine in kids, Haemophilus influenza type B disease disappeared in adults. Used to be the most common, when I started training, okay, which is a marker of how old I am, Haemophilus influenza type B was the most common cause of exacerbations of chronic obstructive lung disease in adults. And as I was doing, from the time I started my residency to the time I finished it, the disease disappeared, just vanished. It was gone. And we said, that's really interesting. Who knew that Haemophilus influenza type B, the reservoir, was children? And when we got rid of the disease in children, we got rid of the disease in adults. That's exceptional and very interesting. And then we did it again with pneumococcal disease, okay? And so now we're starting to recognize how important the reservoir of children are for many infectious diseases, okay? If you're not a microbiologist or a virologist, you think of them as small adults, okay? But what they really are agar plates, okay? They just grow stuff, they're really dangerous. Okay. And new vaccines are coming all the time, okay? So this is an incomplete list of the number of new vaccines that have been introduced in the last 10 years in Canada. The 13-valent conjugate vaccine against pneumococcal infection, shingles vaccine, HPV vaccine, rotavirus vaccine against a common cause of childhood diarrhea, vaccines against meningococcal meningitis of 2 different kinds. So we're seeing, in fact, an increasing number of new vaccines being introduced, lots of potential for doing better against diseases. So I thought we'd just look at 3 new vaccines that we're talking about in 2015. So the first of them is the malaria vaccine. This vaccine, the one that people are talking most about now, is called RTS-AS01. So it's a vaccine against malaria that targets the parasite when it's first introduced into your bloodstream from a mosquito. It's got an adjuvant associated with it. And this is about the fourth or fifth randomized control trial in children in Africa looking at how best to use this vaccine, okay? In some ways, it's been a disappointment. It only protects children from about 50% of cases of disease, and the immunity is not as long-lasting as you would like. People are going to need continuous booster vaccines. And it's an interesting fact that people look at this vaccine and they say it's a disappointment. It's a miracle, okay? You know, that is, as one of the, we're going to talk about the psychology of vaccines in a minute. This is one of our psychological problems with vaccines, okay? That we look at vaccines that are not perfect and say, oh, well, that's really not important. Do you know how many people die from malaria? Do you know how many deaths are prevented if we prevent a third of deaths from malaria? It's an enormous number, okay? It's just silly to talk about this as if it's a disappointment. But nonetheless, we kind of do. So one of the other interesting things when thinking about this vaccine, this is a vaccine in which development of the vaccine started in 1984, okay? So it was started at the Walter Reed Army Medical Institute in the United States, and does give you a measure of how long it takes generally to take vaccines from a concept to something that you can license it, and it was only a couple of months ago that this vaccine got licensed for use around the world. Okay. Here's another piece of really good news in vaccines in 2015. 2 papers actually published, and I just have the slide from one of them, one in Nature and one in Science, in I think the same week this year, that give us a marker of some progress for universal influenza vaccines, right? Our problem with influenza vaccines is that influenza changes every year. And the vaccines we have are made against the part of the virus that changes. That's because most of your immune response is directed against the part of the virus that changes. That's the only mechanism we found to protect you, but it means you have to deliver influenza vaccines every year to be effective. And vaccines that you have to deliver every year are a pain in the neck, okay? So we would really like something that protects you more effectively. And so what this vaccine is here's the hemagglutinin, which is one of the major proteins that generates an immune response, and this half of it that sticks out of the virus is the variable region, and this bottom piece of it is the stem region. And so what these investigators did was they went through a process in which they removed the variable region that sticks out, just leaving the stem region behind. They attached a whole bunch of stems to a nanoparticle. Do not ask me questions about how they did this afterwards. I do not know. And they resulted in these nanoparticles with a whole group of stems sticking out of them. And in mice, they protect mice heterotypically against a particular group of influenza viruses. Okay. There's another group published their results in Science, as I said, in the same week with a completely different approach, but also showed protection of, much broader protection of influenza in mice. When I got excited about this, my son looked at me and said, "That's mice, Mom." And he's right, okay? Mice are not humans, and it's not necessarily going to work that well in humans, but it's the first real progress that we've made in universal influenza vaccines, and it holds a lot of promise, probably for 30 or 40 years from now, but still coming. Okay, here's another piece of really good news on the vaccine front this year, the publication of a randomized controlled trial of a new shingles vaccine. We have a current shingles vaccine which is licensed and used, and prevents about 60% of the morbidity associated with shingles. Efficacy of this vaccine, 97% at all ages. Okay, so big advance for those of us who are facing the risk of shingles going forward. Still going to be probably a couple of years before it gets licensed and becomes available to people. Okay, here's the last piece of really good news about vaccines in 2015, and that's the completion of a randomized control trial of a vaccine against Ebola virus infections. There's a number of really wonderful things about this vaccine. The first of them is, of course, as Canadians, that this is a vaccine that was actually developed at our National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. So this is a Canadian vaccine, and okay, Dr. Feldman did come from Germany, okay, and so it's not entirely by Canadians, but we still have a piece of it that we should be really proud of. The second incredible thing about this vaccine is that this vaccine was taken from phase 1 to the completion of phase 3 trials in 9 months. Okay? If somebody had told you a year ago that we could do this, you would have rightly said that it would be impossible. Okay? This was a vaccine that had only ever once been used in humans before 2014. It was given to a lab worker in Germany who had a needle stick injury when she was working with high concentrations of Ebola virus some years ago because there weren't alternatives. And she did fine, but nobody knew whether that was just coincidence or not. And when the Ebola outbreak started, the World Health Organization started a process to try to accelerate and develop means for moving vaccines into production was intended to deal with the Ebola outbreak, but was also intended to be a model for responding to outbreaks of new infectious diseases. So if you read the names on this trial, 10 countries, 15 organizations, okay, coordinated at a world level, and this was one of 3 trials, okay? This was, one of the problems with this was that this was actually the vaccine that got lucky, okay? So there were 3 different trials with 3 different vaccine candidates, one for Liberia, one for Sierra Leone, and one for Guinea. And the Guinea one was the only one that got off the ground because the outbreak in Guinea lasted longer than the outbreak in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And that, of course, is an issue. If you're involved in this vaccine, it's brilliant, okay? If you've been involved in the development of the other vaccines, now we have a problem because we don't know which one, those vaccines might be as good or better, and we may never know as a consequence. But merely this accomplishment is absolutely amazing and really holds promise for us being able to work together in the world to develop new vaccines when we really need them. Okay, but if you read the newspapers about vaccines and listen to the radio and watch the television, what you're going to have been aware of, right? What do you hear in the news? Right? Measles in Disneyland. The flu vaccine's not going to work this year, right? What you hear about is people being reluctant to take vaccines. So why is that true? What is it about vaccines that mean we have so much trouble with them? One of the analogies that I use with physicians, people are always coming to me and saying, why should I use the influenza vaccine? I get the influenza vaccine and I still got influenza. I say to them, yeah, and you're a physician and you give people antihypertensive drugs all the time because you know that antihypertensive drugs prevent heart attacks and strokes. And when one of your patients taking an antihypertensive drug has a stroke, you do not say, well, that's a waste of time. Guess I'll stop their antihypertensive, right? You say, yeah, some people have complications, right? So it's really interesting that we see vaccines very differently from the way we see other things that we do in medicine. So there's 2 reasons for that, and they're somewhat related to each other. The first is issues with risk perception, and the second we'll talk about later, which is the difference between prevention and treatment in the world. So what's our problem with risk perception? It's listed pretty much on this slide, okay? The problem is that when you're thinking about risk, risk is inflated for a number of different reasons that are completely unrelated to its actual size, okay? So risk feels bigger if the benefit is small, okay? So if you're sitting with a risk that is this size, say influenza vaccine, and well, so who really cares about influenza? Or if you're in Canada, you know, how much a risk is measles to my child? Because the benefit of prevention of disease seems small, the size of the risk gets magnified in your mind. Good experimental evidence. If the benefits are delayed, right, we know all the time, we never buy enough insurance for things, right? Because something that is happening immediately feels more important than something that's going to happen 10 or 15 or 30 years down the line. If something's new and foreign rather than familiar, okay, you and I and all of us in this room are much more likely to die of influenza than Ebola by multiple orders of magnitude. Which is scarier? Okay? That's not rational. We know that's not rational, but you still feel that way. If it's imposed rather than voluntary, if it's something that we don't have control over. So when you talk to people about flying to the Caribbean for a holiday, it is natural to be more worried about the plane trip than the drive to the airport, right? But the drive to the airport is much more dangerous. We know that statistically. That's an absolute truth, that driving to the airport is more dangerous than flying. But it's not the way it feels. Okay, and that's because when I drive my car, I think I have control over the situation, whereas when I'm on a plane, it's somebody else who's dealing with it. Okay, man-made versus natural risks. Okay, if it's something that, so we're much more worried about nuclear power than earthquakes, right? Doesn't make it real, doesn't make it right, but it's the way our brain reacts to risk. And if you actively take it on as opposed to just having it out there. Okay, so when I choose to get my influenza vaccine, I am actively taking on the risk of that vaccine. If I choose not to get it, I am actively taking on the risk of being exposed to influenza, but that feels different, right? So all of these things conspire to inflate the risks of vaccines relative to their benefits. And that creates, this is from a David Ropeig article in the New York Times about 3 years ago now, talking about how we perceive danger, which is worth a read, and this is still on. That's where the How Smart Brains Make Dumb Decisions in the Face of Danger. He's done some really nice writing on how we see, how we perceive risks and why we do dumb things. So the reason for that is about the way our brains are structured, okay? When I talk to you about risk, as soon as I bring up a risk, you get a brainstem response to it, okay? Response in the amygdala that is an emotional response to the fact that you're taking on risk. And your cortex then has to override that response to make you rational. And it is just a truth about human brains that the messages from your brainstem to your cortex are louder and more frequent than messages from your cortex to your brainstem. And what that means is that we as human beings will reliably make stupid decisions faced with risk, okay? We know that we are irrational. And we just, and one of the things that you have to learn to do in dealing with vaccines and writing policy about things is to recognize that people are irrational. Our decisions about vaccines, all of our decisions about risk, will reliably be irrational. And part of having science in the world is so that we can override that irrationality and make the right decisions. So let me give you an example. I want you to close your eyes for a moment, okay? And imagine that you are the chief on one of the Pacific archipelagos. You're the boss. There's 20,000 people who live on this island, and you alone have to make decisions for them. Now imagine that H5N1 is coming. It's the H5N1 influenza, the one that kills 50% of the people that infects, has finally made it to where it can infect humans. And there's an H5N1 pandemic in the world, and it's moving up the archipelago towards you. And you know that in the islands that it's already hit and all the other countries it's hit, everybody gets infected, and 50% of people die. Okay, you with me? Now, you have available to you in your refrigerators a vaccine. That vaccine is 100% effective, and you have enough for everybody, but it comes with side effects. 25% of people who get that vaccine are going to die. So, how many of you, show of hands, are going to give that vaccine to the people on your island? Okay. What if I said that 40% of people were going to die from the vaccine? How many of you are going to give that vaccine? Yeah, so hands, but not as many hands. What about if it's 49%? How many people? Yeah, so this is a science crowd, okay? Oh, wait a minute. I got that wrong. The virus kills 25% of people, and the vaccine kills 50% of people. What are you going to do? It's really cool, right? Why is the second question so easy and the first question so hard? Right? It's how we think. The numbers in those two situations are exactly the same, but how we think about them is different. Okay. And of course, you know, this is what we're trying to save people from. This is Benjamin Franklin quote. In 1736, I lost one of my sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, by the smallpox, taken in the common way. I long regretted bitterly, and still regret, that I had not given it to him by inoculation. This I mention for the sake of parents who omit that operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that therefore the safer should be chosen. Okay? This is not a problem that is new. Okay? It's also not a problem that is going to go away. Okay? It's just the way that our brains are wired, and it will always be a problem in thinking about vaccines. Now, the second piece about using vaccines is about thinking about things that prevent disease as opposed to things that treat or cure disease. So what's our problem with prevention as opposed to treatment? Okay? The first issue is that success is invisible. Okay? In the world of vaccines, the best outcome is nothing happens. Okay? And that's really hard. Okay? It's about seeing, so smallpox, having smallpox eradicated saves us billions and billions of dollars every year. But how many people in this room wake up every morning saying, thank heavens we don't have smallpox? Okay? Just doesn't happen. You don't see it. Okay? Now, Sherlock, this is, you know, so in order to be able to celebrate vaccines and prevention, you have to be able to move the background forward. Okay? It's like the Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that did not bark in the night, right? It's being able to hear the dog that didn't bark to understand about prevention. And that makes it, when success is something doesn't happen, you know what's going to happen at the level of leadership. People don't understand that. They will look at a public health department, say, where nothing is happening, and say, why do we need you? And we do that over and over again. Okay? We're continuously taking money out of public health departments because when they're doing really well, nothing happens. Okay. Success in prevention doesn't come with drama. Okay? How many people in this room remember baby Jessica? Down the well in Texas, right? A really exciting story about a rescue of a 22-month-old that was on everybody's newscast for 3 or 4 days. That was nearly 30 years ago, and most of us still remember it, okay? Treatment things are dramatic. Prevention is just fundamentally boring, okay? Success saves statistical lives, okay? So while baby Jessica was being rescued, tens of kids in the United States died of vaccine-preventable diseases. But they're not real kids. You can't see them. You can't feel them, okay? Those 150 kids a year who got Haemophilus influenza type B disease, they're not in some way real. Not the same as a child you know, okay? Harvey Feinberg, who was the president of the Institute of Medicine, said, what you need to remember is that a health statistic is a number with tears attached. But it's really hard to do that when they just look like numbers. Okay. Benefits are delayed, right? That's not true for all vaccines. Some vaccines you can expect to work in the short term, but it's particularly true now of human papillomavirus vaccine, right? Human papillomavirus vaccine is the vaccine that prevents infection that causes cancer. So the benefits that we're going to see from using that vaccine will be the prevention of cancer 20, 30, sometimes 40 years from now. Okay? And even physicians, a study came out last week looking at American physicians recommending human papillomavirus vaccine, and even us physicians don't do it reliably because it just feels distant. Okay? You don't think the benefit is going to come, and delayed benefits just don't look that important. Okay? For vaccines, it's a complicated issue because for many vaccines, if I get a vaccine, benefit is not just to me, it's also to other people. Okay? It's not true of some vaccines. Okay? Tetanus is one of them. Tetanus bacteria is in soil everywhere, so you will always be exposed to it. And so when you get that vaccine, it's just protecting you. It doesn't have a benefit to other people. But most other vaccines, measles, influenza, chickenpox, if I get vaccinated and I don't get sick, then I can't give it to other people. So when you get to a vaccination of a certain percentage of the population, other people in the population who aren't vaccinated or can't be vaccinated will end up being protected. And that's a really hard balance to think about, okay? Because if I'm choosing to take a vaccine, mostly I'm going to be choosing it for myself, right? The benefit to other people is not as great as the benefit to me, generally speaking. And so it's really hard to know how to balance that effect for individuals in the population. Science changes. Okay? As people are fond of saying, 50% of the things that we know we're actually wrong about. It's just we don't know which 50% that is. And so you watch as vaccines evolve, guidance changes, there's disagreement about things among experts, and that's really hard to incorporate. So the biggest example of this at the moment is influenza vaccine. Influenza is a very complicated disease. There are a huge number of fascinating, if you're into them, arguments about the influenza vaccine, what it does and what it does not do, and how it works, and when it doesn't work. None of them changes the fundamental public health recommendation that everybody over the age of 6 months ought to get vaccinated every year. But the noise out there makes you uncertain, right? And so this backing and forthing of recommendations is really difficult to deal with when you want to get vaccinated. We accept a substantial number of things that are potentially avoidable as normal. It's not such a big problem with vaccines. It's much more prevalent in other areas. One that is exercising a lot of people at the moment is car accidents, okay? What is actually accidental about a car accident? Nothing, okay? It's just a term we've gotten used to so that you can live with it, okay? But they're not accidents, okay? They're avoidable harms. And if we thought of them as avoidable harms, if we framed them as something that was not normal, then we would make progress more quickly. Okay, Sweden is doing that with car accidents, okay? And we don't tend to do that very much with childhood diseases, but we do it a lot with diseases in adults, right? Old people get influenza pneumonia. Old people like me get influenza pneumonia, okay? We think of that as normal when it is potentially preventable, and when we frame it as normal, it's harder to prevent it. This problem is actually a problem of the success of vaccines. Early vaccines, okay, when we picked off the diseases that were most important, where it was easy to make vaccines, okay, we ended up with vaccines that actually saved the healthcare system money. Every dose of vaccine I give means it costs less to provide treatment to people. And then we got used to that. And as vaccines got more complicated to make and the diseases we were preventing got a little less frequent, now not all vaccines actually save money to the system, but we still expect them to, okay? So let's take a look at thinking about costs and different healthcare interventions. So over on the right of this slide, and the cost per life year saved, is one of the ways that we commonly assess introducing different preventive and, for that matter, treatment efforts. And there's actually a World Health Organization guideline for how much you should be spending per life year saved depending on the GDP of the country. Okay, obviously, the wealthier you are, the more often you should be doing it. So measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine actually saves money per life year saved. Okay, so it's cost saving, it's off the table. And then we go from mandatory seatbelt laws, cost $69 per life year saved, up to radiation emission standards for nuclear power plants, which cost about $100 million per life year saved. You can look at these graphs and get a nice idea of the how we think about prevention, and where we're willing to spend money on prevention and where we're not willing to spend money on prevention, okay? Because these are, you look at this and you can recognize that some of the things we do may not make a lot of sense all of the time. So where do vaccines sit? Well, here's a couple of examples of where we're having trouble. HPV vaccine for boys appears to be cost-saving. There's a little bit of argument about the numbers there, okay? So why haven't we introduced HPV vaccine for boys? Interesting question. Sorry?
They're boys.
They're boys, yeah, well, and yeah, I would just let them survive on their own and we'll be okay, yeah. So boys don't get nearly as much disease from human papillomavirus vaccine as girls. Girls get cervical cancer, and cervical cancer kills you. Boys do get anal cancers and throat cancers, but they're much less frequent, and they tend to be diseases associated with homosexual sexual activity, which we still have trouble wrapping our heads around as a society. And so when people started using HPV vaccine, there was a feeling that if we said we were vaccinating boys, that we were doing it to protect girls. And we really don't like giving people vaccines to protect other people, okay? Doesn't feel in some way right to us. And so we didn't start that way when maybe we should have. But it's also about how much money it costs. And you look at me and say, you just said it's cost saving, okay, but of course, money isn't uniformly distributed, it comes in silos. An HPV vaccine on the scale of vaccines and in the silos in our provinces that pay for vaccines is a big chunk of change. If vaccines were part of our entire healthcare system, okay, if they were actually in direct competition with what we were doing in hospitals, that would look a bit different, okay? But the way we've structured silos mean that it makes it hard to move forward with funding for vaccines. And interestingly, it's one of the, there are a lot of good things about the Canadian healthcare system relative to the American health system, but one of the things with vaccines that sometimes gets in our way is that we have a single payer system. And we have very small silos for paying for vaccines in Canada, and it's actually really hard to get vaccines paid for because of that structure, whereas in the United States system for paying for vaccines is much more broadly distributed. It's much easier to get vaccines paid for in the US relative to Canada. Okay. The next issue is about the fact that our vaccine manufacturers are now major pharmaceutical companies. So vaccine manufacturers used to be smaller. When Connaught Labs was Connaught Labs, it was actually a government business, and there still are. So the Commonwealth Serum Labs in Australia that makes vaccines, still a publicly funded and run vaccine company, but most vaccines have been taken over by pharmaceutical companies. This has real advantages, okay? They do good development work. They know how to develop safe vaccines. There are good reasons why we've done it. But for vaccines, it makes it look like pharmaceutical companies are just trying to sell vaccines, and it's absolutely true. Primary goal of any company is to make money for its shareholders. And I think all of us are really struggling with that issue of when is it okay for companies that do preventive things to be companies that are privately held and privately owned, and it makes a substantial number of people really nervous about taking vaccines. And then finally, and I said I was going to come back to this issue of conflicts with personal, religious, and cultural beliefs when I talked about polio vaccine in Nigeria. Because when we tried to introduce human papillomavirus vaccine in North America, we got into trouble very quickly with Roman Catholic school boards. Now, HPV vaccine prevents cervical cancer. It works. It's a huge body of scientific evidence that tells you that it is impossible to prevent sexually transmitted diseases with behavioral interventions. We know that doesn't work. So we know that HPV vaccine will protect girls from cancer. But it's still really deeply tied into the principles of sexual abstinence in some religious groups. And there were a bunch of people who just couldn't get past that, okay? It took until this spring for the last Roman Catholic school board in Canada to allow public health clinics for HPV vaccine in their schools. Okay, a very substantial fraction of them, when this vaccine was introduced, would not allow public health departments into their schools to offer this vaccine to kids. Okay, so those issues of, and part of our problem with HPV vaccine was how quickly it got framed as a sexual behavior issue as opposed to a preventing cancer vaccine. So cultural issues are, and religious issues are really important. And it's actually more important than that. And if you're interested in thinking about this issue, there's a group at Yale led by Ed Kahan who work on something called the Cultural Cognition Project. The Cultural Cognition Project is about understanding that sometimes what you believe in is not about what you know, but is about who you are. Okay? If you think about it, okay, most of us, however hard we work at it, don't know that much about the science behind climate change, or the data behind influenza vaccine, or what's really important about preventing gun violence. Those are all huge bodies of science in which you need 10,000 hours, right, to become an expert. So a piece of what you believe in about anything scientific is about who you trust. And who you trust is about who's in your community and what the chat in your community is and what other people in your community believe. So there is good evidence in the United States that whether you believe in evolution and gun control and climate change is tied much more tightly to whether you're a Democrat or a Republican than it is to what you actually know about those things. If you take the value-laden thing and you just ask about the science, people know the science. It's just that they don't believe it. Okay? And that's a really important issue. Okay? Less of an issue in Canada than it is in the United States now, but it makes some things in science polarized by belief as opposed to science. And that's a really important thing that we have to be thinking about in a public policy perspective about how we stop that from causing arguments about science and belief. If we want science to be taking us somewhere, we need not to have those wars. So lastly, what we do about this, okay? Stuck with the fact that we are reliably irrational, okay? There's a whole lot of things that bias against using vaccines. What do we do about it? Well, a piece of it, of course, is just about education. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that education is not enough, and people are absolutely right about that, okay? It is necessary, but not sufficient, okay? And my best example of education was a few years ago at Sinai. We had our staff influenza vaccination group had decided that we were going to go with a get the facts, not the flu. So we're going to have an evidence-based campaign for influenza vaccination. And then just as the campaign was starting, the two leaders of it in the occupational health department both left the hospital. And we had this void, and everybody was sitting around saying, what are we going to do about this? And I had a program planner who had been working with us in a research study that was coming to an end, and I said, why don't you borrow her for 2 months to organize the influenza campaign? And somebody came up to me and they said, Allison, she doesn't believe in influenza vaccine. And I said, yep, I do know that. But I'm not worried about it because the poor woman is going to have to spend 2 months on this evidence-based campaign, and when she has spent those 2 months, not only is she going to get vaccinated, but she's going to bring her husband and kids in and get them vaccinated too. And they all looked at me like, oh yeah, right, Allison. And she did, okay? The reason I knew that is because I know with absolute confidence that if you know enough about influenza vaccine, and you're not part of a group that is solidly against it, you will be fine. Okay, you will for sure get your influenza vaccine. I just don't know how to get everybody to spend 200 hours working on it, okay? That's, who's got 200 hours to worry about influenza vaccine? So education is really important. We need to really think about engineering systems to reduce the need for individual action, okay? So these can be really small things. Take, for instance, influenza vaccine in pharmacies, okay? Enormously effective, relatively small change that just makes it easier to do the right thing, okay? Lots of examples of how we can do that. There's some places that are actually providing incentives for vaccination, okay? So we incentivize physicians now in Ontario for providing regular vaccines to their patients. But in Australia and in Mexico, they actually pay people, okay? You get tax credits for having your vaccines, okay? So perfectly logical, okay? And I'm just going to give you an example of how effective you can be in prevention by using policy. Whoops, how did I go back? Okay. So this is a graph of life expectancy in boroughs around New York City, 1987 to 2009. And in that time, the largest increase in life expectancy is this red line. It's Manhattan, okay? What is it about Manhattan that increased life expectancy that dramatically. That's 6 months for every year of life, as opposed to 3 months for every year of life, which was the average I told you about at the beginning. Okay, what happened in Manhattan? What happened in Manhattan was Michael Bloomberg as mayor, the city council that went with him, and Tom Frieden, who's now the head of the CDC, but was then Commissioner of Health for New York City. They had, in fairness to them, they had just come out of a devastating multi-drug resistant TB epidemic that occurred because people took all the money out of the New York City Public Health Department in the 60s and 70s, okay? But when they sat down after they had recovered from that and said, what can we do? They made a conscious decision that they were going to work on improving public health in New York City. And you will recognize, first of all, you'll recognize there's been a lot of chat about it, okay? Not everybody's all that happy about some of the things, okay? But New York City has worked at, they were one of the first places to get rid of smoking in public places, okay? They've put calorie counts on menus. They have worked at supporting public transit, about making walkable areas to live in the city, okay? Systematically worked at improving public health in New York City, and look what it does. Okay, so you can, in fact, work miracles with prevention if you just want to badly enough. And one of the nicest stories about this was when the first of these campaigns was about stopping smoking in public places. Had actually much bigger effects than anybody was expecting on reductions in cardiovascular disease. And Tom Frieden, who is the Commissioner of Health, goes into Michael Bloomberg's office with this proposal to stop smoking in public places. And they've spent a long time building on it because everywhere you've heard, right, people say, well, if you stop smoking in restaurants, people will go and eat in neighboring jurisdictions and all these terrible things are going to happen. And so he's armed with all of his data and he's ready to go, and he walks into Bloomberg's office and he says, we have a recommendation here to stop smoking in public places. And Michael says, is it going to save lives? Are you confident of that? And Tom says, yes, absolutely. And Michael says, great, go do it. And Tom then starts on all of this stuff he's prepared about why it's going to be so hard and what they need to do and everything else. And Michael says, Tom, the first lesson about sales is when you have made the pitch, leave. So we'll stop there. And I think we have time for some questions. Thank you.